Welcome everyone to the panel discussion on the future of democracy. We are very excited for you all to join us today. My name is Sophie Lugani and I am part of the organizing team of the German-American Conference this year. In 1 month's time, President Biden has called for an international summit on democracy, bringing together leaders across the world, many of whom have acknowledged that our democracy is in crisis. Today, our panelists will be assessing the collective Western response to various tendencies undermining democracy. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Anne McElvoy, whom you may already recognize as the host of our podcast episodes. Anne McElvoy is the senior editor of The Economist and also writes on political and international affairs and heads Economist Radio. Welcome, Anne.
Lovely to be with you, and thank you very much for having me, Sophie. My job for this next hour is simply to guide this fantastic panel through one of the most important subjects facing us at the moment, which we hope you will be interested in as well if you're joining us here, whether you're watching or listening subsequently. It is nothing less than the future of democracy. And as Sophie says, it comes in the run-up to that big democracy summit that President Biden has ahead of him. That's been in the news already in terms of what the criteria are for taking part. And I think that gives us something of an indication about how difficult and multi-layered this subject is. What does it take to be actually in the room at a subject on democracy when democracy around the world is failing in so many places? I've also just interviewed the 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners, of course, one from Russia and one from the Philippines, both of whom facing precisely that difficulty in the work that they do. I thought it was interesting perhaps also to note that today was Angela Merkel's last European Council summit. She's done well over 100, but that the subjects are, in the big picture, many of them largely the same as when she started out: the future of the democratization of Europe after the end of the Cold War, particularly, of course, Eastern Europe, but also the challenges of populist movements and disruptions across Europe, and also, shall we say, the ability of conventional parties to respond adequately to them. So I hope we cover some of that tonight. But I really should introduce my panel, because they are a fantastic bunch to have with us on this. Slightly different takes, and we hope we'll get them into conversation and also question and answer. So I have Daniel Ziblatt, who many of you will know, of course, teaches science of government at Harvard University. We have Damon Wilson, President and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy, and Ricklef Beutin, who is Deputy Chief of the German mission in Washington, DC. So he's representing the ambassador tonight, but also has an interesting background as Chief of Staff to the former Foreign Minister of Germany, Sigmar Gabriel. So perhaps we might get the curtain lifted a bit about what a new government might be thinking in Germany its role would be in terms of the transatlantic project. So what we thought we'd do, we cooked this up a little bit in advance, got to be said, is that Daniel would lead us off. And I thought I'd ask one big question to each panel, a slightly different one to each. And Daniel, in your case, how would you identify the primary challenges to democracy over the next decade? This is, of course, a specialism of yours. You've covered recent democratizations and what that has meant. But how are they different from the challenges if I'd asked you this back in 1990 as Europe was opening up and we seemed to be looking to a period when democracy was on the front foot in the world?
Yeah, well, first, let me just say it's a great pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. So thank you for the invitation. And yeah, very good question. I mean, I do think that in any discussion of the crises of democracy, it's always useful to just, state up front, the state of democracy, in the global historical sweep is actually quite strong. I mean, when we think about Western Europe, especially in the United States and Eastern Europe, I mean, if we think from the 19th century till today, the US really wasn't a democracy, I would say, fully till 1965. The eastern half of Europe was, of course, there was no whiff of democracy before 1989. So in the kind of long historical sweep, we're in pretty remarkably promising grounds, I would say. Nonetheless, I think there is good reason to worry, and there are a lot of new challenges. And some of these are similar across the Atlantic, so both in North America and in Europe. And I guess I would point to a couple. Number one, there's this continued challenge of radical right parties across, and radical right movements, really, actually, I would say, across both Europe and the United States. That's number one. Number two, there's a rise of a kind of tendency of competitive authoritarianism, as my colleague Steve Levitsky calls it, even in advanced democracies. And so whether one's thinking of recent, the recent revelations out of Austria and the effort from the Austrian government to manipulate polls and manipulate the media, or this recent calls in Britain to reform the election process and kind of interventions in the judicial review process. These are kinds of areas in which you have incumbents trying to entrench themselves in power. And I think in many ways, these are things that Donald Trump attempted to do, but not very successfully at the end of the day. So we see this kind of tendency of competitive authoritarianism. So this is, I think, across the Atlantic, you see these tendencies, but I generally, my sense of it is that the situation is more dire in the United States than in Western Europe. If I had to make a judgment on this, and in particular, first of all, one thinks of how good things look in Germany after the recent elections. The AfD only getting 11% of the vote and so on. But I think more to the point, the main concerning thing for me in the United States, and maybe I'll this is my main point, I would say, is there two things. One, the extreme level of institutional dysfunction in the United States. The United States is working with a very creaky 18th century constitution that is very rigid, and it's preventing the US from confronting basic challenges of governance. And so I think this calls into question the kind of legitimacy of the government for many people. So that's the first point. And the second point, and I want to make sure this doesn't come off as a partisan point, but it's sometimes hard not to make it a partisan point. But the United States is the only country in the Atlantic world, I would say, where one of the two leading parties is essentially not accepted the results of an election. 70% of Republicans, at least in the polls, if we believe these polls, think that Joe Biden wasn't legitimately elected. It's hard to have a really smooth functioning democracy if you have major segments of the electorate not accepting the results of election. And this is something we just don't see anywhere in Europe. And so these two concerns, institutional dysfunction and the kind of semi-loyalty to the democratic system of the current Republican Party, are two things that make me particularly concerned about the US. So these are two new trends, along with, I would say, this rising tendency of competitive authoritarianism everywhere.
You left us promisingly on competitive authoritarianism. I might come back to you about whether it looks like that from this side of the Atlantic, but you've got us off to a great start there. Thank you very much. And so overall, your picture is globally, we have still made strides. We shouldn't forget that, but you have a particular concern, I think, about the United States and the context in which democracy can start to flake away in other parts of the world, even if their constitutions or elections look robust. I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth. You can tell me off later if I am. Let's turn in a bit more detail, if we could, to Europe. And I want to bring in Damon Wilson, President CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. Damon, I know that you've looked closely at events and trends in Europe. And as it happens, we're talking on the day when Angela Merkel is at that last European Council summit, Belarus and Poland very firmly on the agenda there. I said in my opening remarks that in some ways the big questions were the same, but it occurred to me afterwards that really sometimes the countries have changed. It's almost like the questions are the same, but the mapping is different. So what do you make of the current state of democracy, particularly in Europe, or indeed on the fringes of Europe and what we used to think of as the Eastern Bloc and Soviet satellites?
Thank you so much, Anne. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, and really look forward to this conversation. First of all, Anne, you started with today, the Chancellor Merkel's mark and state of democracy in Europe. And I think that's one of the reasons why I felt strongly about joining this as a German-American conference, as the example of Germany as an extraordinary success story of democracy, in particular a unified Germany as a democracy and Chancellor Merkel's contribution to that as a leader in the free world, and something that I think we're really eager to see continue in Germany. Because part of the premise of the challenge that I think we're talking about is the state of democracy in the world today is not great. We are objectively, you could argue, in the 15th year of democratic recession. If you look at the trackings of this over time through Freedom House ratings and rankings, but it's more of less than a democratic recession. It's also an authoritarian resurgence. And we see an aggressive Russia and the rise of China, not only pressing in places like Ukraine and Georgia, Moldova, in Russia's case, but also using our open societies to help seed and divide our open societies. And then you layer on top of this the sort of populist funk that a lot of established democracies have been going through, and you've got uncertainty out there about the state of democracy, and you've got objective setbacks on the state of democracy. And so there is cause for great concern, but it is partly why I think here the premise of our work of supporting democracy and freedom around the world is kind of the premise of what you see President Biden doing with the Summit for Democracy. It is the sense that you have to have democratic unity and solidarity as a starting point, as an anchor point to get this right. And so you ask about the state of democracy in Europe today, and I think we've seen in well-established democracies the growth of political polarization and fringe politics and the populist surge. You've also seen a backlash to that, where populists at times have been losing the confidence of voters of whether they can deliver, ultimately deliver for their citizens. You also see further to the east, despite the pressures or despite the uncertainty and wobbliness sometimes in the strategic West, if you will, and despite the aggressive efforts of an authoritarian, kleptocratic, Putin-led Russia, you see that people are hungry. There is a determination among the people of countries like Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova to demand more accountability and more opportunity to determine their own destiny. And so while we are in a moment of challenge, a great challenge to freedom and democracy around the world, I am optimistic because we see that thirst from individuals, from citizens themselves, the agency of people demanding more, not just to put food on their table, but to protect and demand more about their rights. But I think it's directly connected to whether the United States and Germany and other established democracies can have a sense of common cause and understand that our core values of freedom and democracy are under pressure, and that to get this right, we need a sense of understanding that this is the strategic challenge of our time, requiring a Berlin, a Washington, and other democratic allies to have this front and center as a sense of democratic unity and solidarity of action.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. That segues us very nicely, I think, to our final opening remarks from Ricklef. Beutin, I always feel never let a senior diplomat go to waste. So Ricklef, I'm going to actually issue you a bit of a challenge. We heard there from Damon that transatlantic relationship was vital to sustaining democracy, and both sides are very keen on a lot of warm words about this. It suits their self-image as well as their friendship. But really, I mean, we seem to be at a time when both in defense, in security, often in trade, we have quite wide gaps across the Atlantic, arguably widening gaps. What makes you think at a time when there are such strong disagreements on how to deal with China, Nord Stream 2, I could go on, and I should let you bat for the German government, whichever one we get. But what makes you hopeful at all that this means more than just a lot of rather wonderful intentions?
Well, thank you all. Thank you for having me. Best regards from the ambassador, who I know would have loved to be here, but could not make it today. But I'm happy to be with you all, see you all, and thank you for everyone who was in the conference and in the call. And thank you for the question. And thanks to my former panelists, I have a wide array of things to talk about already. So let me just start by a few points. First of all, I don't disagree with the assessment that democracy is under pressure, that it may be more under pressure than it was if you look back 20 years. But at the same time, I don't think we have to be gloomy and talk ourselves down and be depressed all the time either. I think there's lots to be hopeful about, and that goes for the transatlantic relationship and the German-United States relationship for that matter, and I can elaborate if you want. But I mean, democracies do provide a lot to their citizens, as we all know. And we should say that loud and clear and with optimism and self-confidence, I think. That's my first point. Secondly, I think that, yes, the transatlantic relationship is essential in many, many ways, but also in the discussion over what can we do to bolster democracy in our own countries. And we have to be humble about this and look at our own societies. And Daniel started with this, actually. But also around the world. You know, the transatlantic relationship is key to that, and we will play our part as Germans and Europeans also at the summit that President Biden has called for, which we think is a very good idea. But it has to be wider than that. And that's my third point. I just hinted at that. I think we've got to look at what is going on in our own societies because, frankly, and this is really my point of depression, if you will, if you look at our own societies and if you ask people what they think in the United States, in Germany too, and other European nations, what they think of the current system that is in place, the democratic systems, many would probably answer that the current system isn't working for them. And I think we have to ask ourselves, governments first and foremost, of course, but everybody else who's in education, in other sectors of society as well. How did we get here, and what can we do to rectify that? And I think that is where, as well, the transatlantic relationship can be of a lot of help in exchanging our observations, experiences, and exchanging about tools and instruments that we may have. And they really have to look at all of society. And let me just say one thing about the new German government, which will take a few weeks to come into place. And I mean, nothing is done until everything is done. But the constellation seems pretty clear right now, at least from those parties who are negotiating. And a major talking point, but it's not only a talking point, but it's really about substantive politics of the possible future Chancellor Olaf Scholz was the word respect in his campaign. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. If we look at our own societies or other partner countries, particularly if you want to talk about Europe, for example, but not only, let's ask the question, while there's unacceptable behavior and unacceptable, tendencies, how did we get here, and what is your point of view? I think that's important and remains important.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll just stay with you for a brief moment and then circle back perhaps around the panel and just get you all talking and debating together. Do you feel, when you worked closely with Sigmar Gabriel, a leading figure in the SPD, this does look like a moment of unlikely any other outcome now that Olaf Scholz will be Chancellor? We don't know much about his outlook on foreign affairs, except we do know that his party is perhaps more assertively skeptical about some international relationships with America, going along with America, and that sort of Sergio, I noticed a small frown crossed your face. I might be on the right question or completely the wrong one. We're about to find out. Do you believe that we're in a time when we are seeing some sort of sea change? Because many criticisms and shortcomings can be leveled at Angela Merkel, but I think fundamentally, and even through the most trying times, the transatlantic relationship was important to her, and it was very much anchored in her own experience at the end of the Cold War. What does it mean to Olaf Scholz?
Well, I don't want to make this about Olaf Scholz as a person or the SPD only, if I may.
But they're likely to lead the next government.
That's true. That's true. Absolutely. But I don't think I would agree to the word sea change at all. If you look at what the parties that are now negotiating for the new government, the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the FDP, our term liberals, I know is different from your term, but you know what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about in the German context. They all have a very clear wording about the transatlantic relationship and its crucial role. And they've put this in their paper that came out, I think, last week, where they've, in more general terms, laid out what they are going to negotiate about during the coming weeks. And there's a very, very clear commitment to the transatlantic relationship. Yes, of course, there have been criticisms of the United States in the past, and there have been criticisms from the SPD. You probably are thinking about the Iraq War, but I don't think there's any question.
Well, I'm thinking about going forward, what it really means for defense spending. I'm thinking, what does it mean for the NATO forward presence?
Right.
I'm much more interested in what comes next.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think there's absolutely no doubt that that we are very clear-eyed, Germany overall, and those parties in question now, that the transatlantic relationship is essential for our security in Europe, while we are working on being more sovereign in many ways, if you want to talk about security policy, for example. And that we will not be able to face the challenges that we have in the world without the United States. I don't think there's any doubt, and I think the new government will work in that sense.
A quick point to just remind you in my chat that Sigmar Gabriel, we just mentioned there, former minister in Germany, is going to be taking part in the GAC this year on Sunday. As if by magic. I made that happen with my mind, people. Sunday at 10 a.m. EST, 1400 CET, Central European Time. Do have a listen to him. That was fortuitous, wasn't it? And also, please remember, you can put Q&A questions in as we go along if someone says something that just sparks a brilliant idea or challenge from you. So, Daniel, let me circle back to you if I could. You heard something of a challenge there from Ricklef, which I thought was interesting, along the lines of we have to understand more where the democratic process is seen to or felt to have failed a large number of people. And yet when I listened to your analysis, you were concerned about the US for reasons I think we can probably all intuit. You felt there was competitive authoritarianism, but you did throw in a little bit of the Boris Johnson government, a sort of slightly anything that didn't quite suit a particular view of democracy seemed to strike you as authoritarian. And I wondered if it was maybe time that we stepped back from some of our certainties. And if so, would you accept that challenge?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. I mean, I think...
Well, when you talk about competitive authoritarianism,
yes,
you are already, by the use of the word, you are badging things that you just have a different view of politics or social action.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I think, people can... I mean, democratic politics is about hot, heated debates over policy. I think that what we've grown increasingly alert to, though, is that people can be democratically elected, politicians can be democratically elected, and once in office, try to lock in their advantages. I mean, this is what we've seen in Hungary, where you have election commission institute kind of redrawing of election boundaries, changing of the way that judges are selected, a forced retirement age in Hungary, and to pack the courts. And this is a kind of standard toolbox, I would say, of electoral authoritarians. Now, certainly Western Europe is very far from that. The United States, I would say, is quite far from that. But nonetheless, we should be alert to the kind of tendency of when politicians, democratically elected, try to lock in their advantages to create unfair competition. And so, as long as the opposition can win, then you have a thriving democracy, or at least a democracy. I'm not sure necessarily thriving. And so I think, thinking about the US and the November elections, as troubled as people were about the state of American democracy, the opposition party won. There was a transition of power, very, a close call in some respects, but nonetheless, you had fair competition. So I think anything that tilts the playing field away from fair competition to the benefit of the incumbent is something that is a kind of tendency of competitive authoritarianism. I don't, by no means, I mean, don't misunderstand me. I by no means want to say that Britain is a competitive authoritarian system. It's a highly democratic system, but there are these tendencies that one can see, and you know, that.
But those tendencies for parties, I'm not going to stick on Britain too long, don't worry.
Yeah.
But those tendencies, you know, they are now seen as being something that suits a particular view that people are concerned about democracy have, particularly in sort of liberal America. But actually, they've always existed. I don't know any party that I ever covered in 22 years of writing a political column that didn't try to lock in electoral advantage. So I'm not totally sure what you think the difference is if power can change hands, which I think is your core point.
Yes, yeah. If power can change hands, then the democracy is okay. But nonetheless, one should be alert to efforts to do this. I mean, this is not, democracy is not a machine that runs of itself. It requires that citizens call out abuses of office. And so, you know, not talking about any particular country here, but I'm just saying in general, one has to be alert to these tendencies. And democracy requires not only democratic institutions, it also requires democratic norms or unwritten rules. And so when politicians push the envelope and really try to use power to the max, it can be dangerous for democracy. And I think, you know, I think that the Trump presidency teaches us that, the Hungarian, the Hungary under Orban teaches us this. And so and this is, I think, in some sense, although, you know, we may all be slightly pessimistic about the state of our democracy, I think we're much more alert to these tendencies in our democracies, and that's probably a good thing.
Damon, how does that strike you if we go a little bit deeper into the situation in Europe? You could look at it and say, slightly along the lines that Daniel was describing in the US, that you'd had clear and palpable threats to democracy, and also one shouldn't forget that democracy isn't just elections. It's the judiciary, it's the free press, it's lots of things that are coming under pressure, particularly in Eastern Central Europe. Though, you know, of course, French election could get a bit exciting in the wrong way as well. And yeah, you know, the most exciting thing you can say for Germany is you swap a slightly sort of CDU leader who some people thought was a bit SPD-ish for someone who's definitely a bit SPD-ish, and not much has really changed in the big picture of democracies. France, well, we'll see, but somehow we've had many threats in that first round to the great nation that is France from the extremes, and yet somehow it seems to wash out. So where do you put your balance of hope and fear when it comes to Europe? This one's for Damon, and then please, I'm just going to ask you guys to debate a bit among yourselves.
Thank you, Anne. Well, look, my view of this is that Europe and the context of the transatlantic relationship better be an anchor of the free world, a spine of the free world that is able to show that we can self-correct at home, we can own and be accountable to our people, that we deal with the non-linear development, which is messiness of democracy, but that ultimately that we're united by these universal values, and that this is an anchor of free people, because that's what's going to be necessary to understand that the real challenge we're going to be facing in the coming decades is the aggressive autocrats and the perpetuation of their norms and distortion within international organizations and others, of really an offense that they're undertaking in favor of authoritarianism. What it means is that you're exactly right. Politics is about power. Like, let's not, I mean, we understand that political parties fight tooth and nail to win. And we don't necessarily want to rely on goodwill. We need to understand that the democratic systems often are built with checks and balances that understand the self-interests of political actors. But that's the point. How are the checks and balances? Where are the norms that Daniel mentioned? How do citizens have the ability to hold people accountable? You need an activated citizenship. You know, we're talking about the state of democracy in Europe, and by definition, some of you have mentioned obviously the United States. And I just think about Alexis de Tocqueville, who, I'm from South Carolina, Jim Clyburn. So Jim Clyburn, an African American from South Carolina. I'm from South Carolina as an openly gay man. We have kind of understood, and particularly African Americans in my state, that the full expression of our democracy has taken a while. And Jim Clyburn quotes Alexis de Tocqueville saying, America was not the most enlightened country, but it has an ability to repair its faults. And that's the test I think all democracies are facing today. The simultaneously challenge of an assault from autocrats and Beijing and Moscow pushing on the international system aggressively, while we've got wobbliness at home of how we think about our own responsiveness to our people and our politics. So what we need to see in established democracies, whether it's the United States or Europe, is that process of self-correction, that process of electorates holding people accountable, holding leaders accountable. And where you've got wear and tear, you see this in the European Union, where you can be concerned about how that has been squeezed. If you look at a media environment in Hungary, if you look on the margins of Europe, in the Balkans, of consolidation of power in certain leaders, and certainly this has been the case in Turkey, the struggling of transitional democracies in Georgia. But yeah, you see real hope in Moldova today, which has taken a huge step forward. But we know when there is uncertainty in the established democracies, when we're wobbly, it's going to be even more difficult on the periphery. And that's why I think the quality of Europe's democracy is so critical and so important, as something that provides both a North Star, but also as a way of understanding that this is part of the way Europe engages in the world, consistent with its values in support of universal liberties. And part of the test that we're facing right now is to show that democracy ultimately is able to deliver the best pathway for security, prosperity, and dignity for its citizens. And so despite democracy's dysfunctions, which are a norm of struggling with our injustices, we hold ourselves accountable, we expose our injustices ourselves. We still have to show that this works.
Let me just bring in, because we've got about a good 10 minutes before we go to questions. Ricklef, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to ask each other, or perhaps any challenges you might have to each other. You've been remarkably courteous, much more so than your host. That's a good thing. You get to be an uppity Anglo-Saxon at times. You know, we're kind of taking our revenge here for that revolution of yours. Ricklef, from what you've heard, what strikes a chord with you? What might you question?
What I don't want to question so much as say, I think what Damon just said is great, and we need to work on that. Who are my fears? Let's start this way. We're seeing the phenomenon that the political opponent is no longer just the opponent, but like an enemy to the death that you can never agree with. You see people questioning the system as a whole, democracy as a whole. You see information bubbles where people don't seem to get out of and don't receive, a more objective or at least diversified field of it. All these parts of the phenomenon, I think, play a role in the question: who can rectify and self-rectify these norms drifting away? There are things that used to be, nobody would be able to say these without having to step down at some point or pretty quickly. And that seems to kind of be on a slide down somehow in many senses. And how do you autocorrect this? It can only come from the electorate. It can only come from educated people who say, no, this is enough. Enough is enough. This is not something you can do in our system. But how do you get there? And I'm afraid just that if you can't just rectify this by people having a little more money in their pockets, but it's more of a generational effort again to get where we may have been a little more at some point, and we need to get to again, and there I think we all have to ask ourselves the question: what can we do about this kind of education? So what are governments doing about this in terms of respect for the other side? What is an institution like Harvard, an elite institution that brings out great minds? What can it do to reach the other side who feel that they could never be there and they could never have this education? What can journalists do, if I may, to help that along? I think those are the hard questions, and we don't really have a convincing answer yet.
Daniel, do you want to come back? Any thoughts that might?
I think, so I come back, I'm a political scientist, and so I often find the source of our ills less in our people and more in our rules, because I think in the institutions, because I think in many ways, our electorates are very similar across the Atlantic in the US. I mean, we have roughly 20 to 30% of the electorate everywhere that's vulnerable to the appeals, I would say, of populism. That's a pretty constant figure, actually, historically and and across countries. The trick is how to make sure, how to first of all make that number lower. I mean, you can do that to some degree, but the second point, and that's I think what Ricklef was just talking about, how can we make citizens to not regard each other as enemies and so on. But that that's a long-term struggle. But the second challenge, and in some ways the most acute challenge, is how to make sure that group of voters doesn't control government. I mean, in order for our democracy to survive, I mean, at some level, at the end of the day, we need to have institutions that were, across. And another way to put this is there's broad majorities in Europe and the United States that are pro-democratic, that are inclusive, that are open-minded. But I think many of our political systems, and I think the U.S. again, beating up a bit on the U.S. here, majorities don't always govern, with the nature of our electoral college, the nature of the US Senate. Again, I come back to the theme of our kind of outmoded institutions and constitution. Minorities often govern, electoral minorities. And so I think this ultimately, what this suggests is that what needs to happen is we need to reform our institutions. And this is a general lesson, I think, everywhere, to make democracy more accountable so that these majorities, these open, inclusive majorities can actually speak.
Damon.
Yeah, I would say, and I hear the tenor of this. I think we need to have humility in our approach. But I guess the question I would raise and maybe turn to Ricklef a little bit on this. Partly President Biden's announced a summit for democracy. It's a summit for democracy in which democracies will come together to make commitments to show how we are actually focused on renewal at home so that we can actually cooperate well together. And I think democratic unity is a starting point. The concern I have is that too much humility, if you lose confidence in the underlying universality of the values behind human rights and human dignity and freedoms, it leads to a sense of, well, how can we advocate this in our foreign policies? How can this be a plank and a premise of how we engage, whether it's in transitional democracies or whether it's with Russia or China? And I think the great cause of our time is the competition between democracies and autocracies to show what is going to be most effective in delivering for people. And this is where I think we've got to, yes, be humble in our approach, but still confident in our values, and that this be front and center in how the United States and Europe engage in the world to understand, despite the challenges we have at home, despite the differences we have across the Atlantic, that if we aren't working together as the core of the free world to stand up to how the Chinese are distorting technology norms or how the Russians are intimidating their neighbors, this is going to get more difficult, and it's going to be a more dangerous world for democracy. So be humble in our approach, but not so much that we curtail in our foreign policies or we can curtail in the way we engage in the world. And I think that's one of the things I'll be looking forward to in the new German government, to see that those values that are so important to us at home are values that inform a foreign policy strategy for Europe.
Ricklef, isn't the truth, if we look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the largely, very particularly when it came to the speed of the withdrawal, the degree of unilateralism on the American side, which many of the allies, the traditional allies, but also more recent allies in interventions like Germany were rather put out about. That the problem, I think, with what Damon suggests is not that it isn't wise. It strikes me as extremely wise, but not very observable in the way that big geopolitical alliances are working out right now. If we look at China, we see essentially a mercantilist German position. I know there have been some questions about that, perhaps more from the center and the center left in this campaign. That will things change there? It's unlikely still, I think, that Germany and America will be entirely aligned on approach to China. So to take Damon's sort of recipe for confidence, yes, but for confidence to work, you actually have to want to do some things together. Are you really sure that that will is there on either side of the Atlantic?
I am very positive. And actually, the differences you make out are definitely not as deep as I think you are suggesting. And that is true for China as well. Let me say why. First of all, it's a bit of a cliche, although cliches always have a true core of the mercantilist Germany, whereas the United States is looking at the values and being hard on China now. The Germans actually led dialogues with the Chinese over human rights for years and years, whereas other European countries were never able to do or not willing to do it. One. Yes, there is.
It didn't work out very well, though, did it?
Well, but did it from anybody else's side who didn't even try? That's the question. So there's always been a balance on China policy from Germany. I'm saying that is not recognized. Now, where we are now with the new administration, we just had a dialogue. My Asia Director General from the Foreign Office was here the past few days. And I can tell you from all the dialogues that we had, our analysis about China does not differ at all. The question is, of course, in the instruments and in the strategy. And I don't see differences of the degree that you seem to suggest either there. Because if you look at, there's rhetoric from the United States government and from the Europeans that is very similar on, cooperative aspects of a relationship with China and competitive aspects. And the question is, where are those and where are your own strategic interests? And I think it's glossing over, frankly, and it is never mentioned that the United States and the United States companies have deep entanglement with the Chinese economy as well. And that there are economic interests and workplace interests.
I wasn't trying to suggest that only one side was mercantilist. I couldn't quite see a joint proposition emerging.
I agree that we're not there yet because the United States administration is still in the process of formulating its China policy. And as we know, the new German government is not in place yet. So yes, we have a lot to talk about, but I think we're definitely working in the right direction, and between Europe and the United States as well. I mean, if you look at the Trade and Technology Council and all the different working groups and topics that were addressed there and are being taken forward now, I think there's a lot of alignment, much more alignment than difference.
It seems like a good time to go to questions. And as it happens, I wanted to come back. Sorry, Daniel, if there's anything you wanted to add off the back of that, please do. But in fact, there's a question which I think has bubbled throughout the conversation. I'm very pleased that someone has gone to the trouble of formatting it for me. And that's from Tobias Fertig. He says, hey, going forward, do you think technology will help democracy via availability of information, connecting people, accessibility, making voices heard, etc.? We had a sort of very strong plea for more of that from Damon. Or will it hurt democracy via well-known negative phenomena at the moment, social media bubbles, false information, and their virulent spread, integrity of voting results being damaged, etc.? Gosh, I mean, this is one thing probably, Daniel, for doing your job 20 years ago, I might have asked you some of the same questions, but I wouldn't have been asking you this with such emphasis, and it's become core, hasn't it, to what you work on in terms of democracy in America and beyond.
Yeah, and I'm glad that Tobias asked this question, because I mean, this is something that I think is a major challenge facing all of our democracies, is how to deal with the rise of new social media and so on. And I mean, the first point I would make, though, is that all media, all technology is double-edged. I mean, one can think of the radio and Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats and how this, helped America respond to the Great Depression so effectively on the one hand, but on the other hand, the radio was also the technology that Adolf Hitler used to consolidate power. And so, and similarly, I think, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, are tools of liberation, as they were during the Arab Spring, but there also can be tools of both polarization and radicalization. And this is, I think, one of the big challenges that we need to begin to think about how to deal with this, as well as tools of surveillance. So, on the previous point, though, of tools of radicalization or avenues or channels of radicalization and polarization, this is something that I think we're only just beginning to get our minds around. First, how significant of a problem is it? And I think it's a pretty significant challenge. I think I was somebody who early on was a bit skeptical of this. I mean, I sort of thought that, and there are these studies that show that, if people only listen to, these experiments that social scientists do, where you only listen to radio, that you or look at social media websites and so on, that you agree with, that if the beginning of the study and at the end of the study, you kind of move further in that direction, both the right and left. But these are quite small percentages. But I think these kinds of studies understate the scale of the problem. And so I think the thing that I hope gets discussed at any kind of summit of democracies is how to deal with this challenge. And, and this question of the balancing of free speech and the damage that that Facebook, et cetera, due to our social fabric. How do we balance these things out? And each country is going to respond to these in different ways because of our different constitutional traditions and legal traditions. And the free speech, First Amendment, for instance, rights in the United States really limit the ability of government to regulate these institutions. But I think this is something where there needs to be conversations, discussions, both between technologists, so people who know how the technology works, philosophers, people who kind of know what are our values, as well as social scientists and policymakers. And so I think this is a cutting edge kind of issue.
Would anyone else like to come in on that before I go somewhere else for questions?
And I think it's central to the issue of the future of democracy. Look, the great technological awakening was at first seen as something that would really empower citizens and citizen voices and activate participation across the world. And we've seen that positive trend. But we've also now seen that backlash about how authoritarians are using surveillance technology, how they're using this to shape norms and a way to really control their own people, to put up the Chinese firewall, if you will, to coach other societies. We're seeing cooperation between Cubans, Chinese, Russians, Belarusians, all on using technology for ill. And so part of the real challenge we have is to understand we've got a couple different issues in play. That, as Daniel said, it's a double-edged sword. There is a debate in democratic societies about how we should regulate and what are the norms to guide, social media companies, and what's the right content privacy and all of that. And there is a natural and normal debate to have in open societies about that. We run the risk of a little bit of moral equivalency with the debate on understanding how the Russians and Chinese and others are using technology to actually go after human rights defenders, to go after autocrats. And so Germany, the United States, Europe, the transatlantic relationship, we need to understand we need to sort through the democratic norms around technology within our societies. But on the international stage and in UN bodies and the ITU and others, we need to be vigilant about no moral equivalency about using technology to actually go after civil rights activists. And that's where we need a little bit more common cause.
Ricklef, how does that strike you in the context of Germany? Sometimes a perception that perhaps that the desire to be open, in particular, I'm thinking here about Russian intervention and meddling and worse, but that desire where Germany sits geostrategically, it'd be surprising if it didn't seek strong relationships with Russia, but that has ended up with a sort of permeability in Germany and in some German institutions to undermining, to fake information. You, of course, understand both sides. You've been in, in the apparat there, the government in Germany. You're now in diplomacy in Washington. How many similarities do you see, and are there things that you think are a bit different?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. Similarities between
in terms of the impact of fake news spread. Technology was the area here, and the spreading of threats to democracy spread through big platforms, however you wish to define it.
I think the phenomena are essentially the same on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of technological advances having downsides and being, providing also fertile ground for more populism and even more authoritarianism or authoritarian regimes to reach into our societies and our systems. I think where a slight difference may be between Germany and the US or Germany and other countries is that we've not seen the same kind of polarization politically, because our party system is more diverse. There's not one against one, so that it spreads out a little bit further. And maybe also the system of press and education kind of, there's less divide between elite and others, or at least the feeling of that. But that's no reason to gloat or be self-satisfied somehow. It's, we see the same problems, and we have to think about the same types of regulation and guardrails that we need to put in place to protect freedom of press and speech and our system at home. And I completely agree with what Damon said about international bodies as well.
Possibly a related question, but I think it goes a bit broader, from Richard Rosen, who wanted to know, corporations are clearly major political players in most countries. What role have corporations played in undermining democracy, says Richard, wearing his heart on his sleeve, I think, with that question. So have corporations, to ask it perhaps in an open way to any of you who'd like to answer it, have corporations played a role in undermining democracy?
And
who'd like that one?
A quick
there you
go.
Look, good idea. I'm looking for a baseball metaphor, but you just went for it. That's great.
Well, and I will say, first of all, I believe that free societies depend on free enterprise. I think having a free market, free enterprise companies are actually should be part of a vibrant set of pluralistic actors in our societies that make things work. Because when you see the absence of free markets and free enterprise, what do you get? You have to work for the government. You have to have your income through public funds. When that dominates your economy, it leads to a manipulation of power, corruption, lack of choices for individuals. When you can actually carve your own way out and earn income and without having to rely on the public sector, it creates a flourishing opportunity for free enterprise. But the problems that we've seen are twofold. One, when do you have monopolistic behavior by corporations? And that's part of why we have anti-monopoly. And it's a big debate we're having about how to think about tech companies today, because we can't quite figure that out. But the bigger issue, the real bigger issue, is how we have allowed our systems, our free market systems, to be manipulated by authoritarian autocrats, kleptocrats, and that corrosive capital has become an undermining factor of open democratic societies. And that when we allow our real estate markets, our private investment accounts, when shell companies, and we allow ill-gotten funds from dictators or autocrats around the world to actually earn returns in our high growth markets, this is a problem. And so we've got a corrosive capital challenge that we've got to figure out how to address, that doesn't let ill-gotten means from corrupt forces or from autocrats actually protect their resources in Western democracies. And that is a front and center challenge for us today.
Who else would like to come in on that before we move on?
I guess one other thing I would say, I think economic inequality is a problem for democracy. And the idea that if there's overly concentrated wealth, this gives some people more political voice in a democracy than others. So that's clearly the case. On the other hand, I think I agree with Damon here that, what we've seen in the fights over voting rights, for instance, in the United States, that in many states where there's been efforts to restrict the voting rights or to kind of make it more difficult to vote, corporations have actually stood up and made noise about this under pressure from their customers and from their stockholders. And so I think, in fact, the private sector can serve as a progressive force and as a bulwark of democracy in these kinds of instances. And so it depends on who's running the companies. It depends on how stockholders are organized, and it depends what customers demand.
On the intelligence podcast from The Economist, the daily current affairs on this week, we had the extraordinary dive into the Mariupol in Ukraine and the 2014 standoff there, and a really interesting piece by our foreign editor who went back and talked to people and got into the story of basically the local oligarch who got people out on the streets and saw off the Russians. So I don't know what you make of that, people. Do you want your democracy underwritten by the local oligarch, or are you prepared to take what you can get if you're in Ukraine?
It is a tough call. I went to see Renat Akhmetov directly at that time, And
Right.
to have the conversation to say, look, you have a checkered history. You have a problem. You can't travel to the United States. But everybody will remember what you do right now. Do you play a part in saving your country, or do you hand it over to Russia? And everybody will remember that. And so, you know, this was a messy situation. Exactly right.
How interesting. I mean, it's a very good, it's a small, you know, example in the global picture, but of the extraordinary trade-offs that can be happening in real time when flashpoints occur. Now, let's crack on, because I know we've got a good 5 minutes, but I know that Damon particularly has to head off right on the dot. What have we got? We have mentioned previously in discussion, there's an increasing tendency to view political opponents as enemies. Sorry, I can't read the bottom of that question. I don't know if someone can help me out there. Yes, so now I can. Exacerbated by media subcultures, technological bubbles. So what steps should policymakers take to ensure that social cohesion, to ensure the social cohesion necessary for democracy to function? I'm going to interpret that broadly. Maybe I could come to you first, Ricklef, and just say, there's a bit of a sort of, what do you really want this panel to happen in concrete terms? So you could answer on technology, or you could perhaps come up with something else that you think is a concrete step that would help. What would it look like?
Well, I think the first thing is, indeed, although it doesn't seem very hands-on yet, but I think it's crucial that we exchange on so many levels of our societies about these issues. And so, yes, the new German government and the current administration have to get together as soon as possible on these issues. And actually, when the chancellor was here, she discussed with the president as well about, you know, future questions and democracy questions, frankly. And it's in the statement that they that was made about the meeting, if you want to look at that. But that's not enough, right? I mean, exchanges between academia, exchanges on the city level, exchanges through, you know, I don't know, any kind of organization or unorganized meetings in our societies are good to you know, think about, are we doing the right thing? Are we saying the right things? Are we putting ourselves in the shoes of the other person as well, at least at, you know, a small percentage of the day, rather than having constant outrage about the other side, which is very likely to happen if you only look at Twitter or some other media. And that is true also for, you know, institutions that in general try to portray a completely different picture. And I'm talking about, you know, education systems. You know, are we all on college campuses thinking about that, or are we not? Or do we see a tendency to have more liberal and less liberal, or more you know, conservative universities? Is that a trend, or can we keep it together? One thing, but that's not something that the governments can decree, right? That's what my appeal is to everybody here, to governments, yes, but also everybody who's, you know, shaping society, and that's all of our audience, I think.
Because this may be the last sort of full round of questions, Daniel, I'll come back to you, and if I could, I might just supplement with a question from Susanna. Excuse me if I don't get your pronunciation right, Susanna. Tseleni. Thank you. Any help gratefully received. But that she makes the point that you would need to put tools in the hands of people to make politicians more accountable. That's been a bit of a theme around the panel tonight. And I think Susanna sort of asks a good pointed question as we come towards the end of the hour. Well, what would those tools maybe look like? Daniel?
Well, I think that's right, that institutional reform, ongoing institutional reform, continuously mending of our democracy, just as you continuously need to mend your house and make repairs. I think our institutions need continuous repair, and those are going to vary from country to country. You know, in the United States, I think there's some very clear areas where we could change the way. I mean, there's a court commission that just was Biden's court commission came up with some recommendations, including introducing term limits for judges. This is a kind of thing that may seem like a small detail, but in fact would maybe reduce polarization and fights over judges. So I think these kinds of institutional reforms at the national level, at the state level, are ways of making our democracies less polarized, and this kind of enemy type of politics that we've just been talking about, but would be reduced if our governments are more responsive to citizens. So that's one. There's lots of other these voting reform. There's two proposals in front of the Senate right now to reform how people vote. These kinds of things. And to give you just one final example, I know we're short on time here. In Germany, there's these discussions about changing the size of the Bundestag. And so in every country there are a set of institutional reforms, but I think we need to be open to these reforms. That's sort of the general message I would make.
Damon, I think this is going to be the last thought from you. You can wrap it as your final thought anyway, of course, that you like, but there was just a question I might ask you to touch on from Daniel Vasella, who said, rise of authoritarian civil society actors contributing to democratic backsliding, India, Poland, Hungary, the US, contradicts the liberal belief of civil society as a strong pillar of democracy. I.e., if civil society is so strong, how come democracy has allowed itself to get into this state? Your thoughts on that, and anything you might like to say before you leave us?
Yes, I do have to jump. I wouldn't quite frame it that way, because I actually think the vanguard of protecting our democracy needs to be civil society. It needs to be citizens. And it doesn't mean that because we see pressure in India or other places that civil society has failed. I think it means we're going to have to rely on an activated civil society and citizenry to hold folks accountable, to use the tools of open data and transparency and information to hold accountable leaders, to hold leaders accountable. And so I will look to civil society to be part of the answer where we do see deconsolidation or backsliding in democracy. And with that, Anne, I will have to sign off.
But you have to go. You've got a lot of democracy to save. You better get going. We'll say goodbye to you. I'll keep our other two guests just for a last thought. Bye, Damon. Thank you. So I think, Daniel, perhaps the last thought from you, and then we should, of course, let Ricklef perhaps have a final word as well. Okay, so I'll ask a question that's been hovering in my mind. Do you see a return of Trumpism at the next election, or do you feel that we're over that part of the exciting cycle, somewhat over-exhilarating cycle of American politics?
I think, unfortunately, yes. I mean, there is. I mean, among the Republican Party, because Trumpism is not just Trump; it's about Trumpism, and it's pretty clear that the Republican Party has since January 2021 has become further Trumpified, and through retirements and so on, the party is a transformed party. And in fact, I recently saw a statistic that the percentage of Republican members of House of Representatives who've come into office since the rise of the Tea Party, so 2011 roughly, is like 60%, 70%, or even higher than this. So it's essentially when you think of the Republican Party, that party that was around in 2008 is no longer the party that's around. And so I think, this, not to say that we're doomed to this fate forever, but I think, as we know in a democracy, the way that politicians change is if they lose elections. And they lose repeatedly and then learn to change their behavior. And so that's ultimately the cure of and that's the kind of beautiful self-correcting logic, both of the market and of democracy. And so, from my perspective, I hope that that's what happens, because otherwise, if you don't lose, you don't learn. And if you don't learn, you don't change. And so ultimately, I think that's what we have to look forward to over the next few years.
Ricklef, last word goes to you.
Thank you. Always a hard thing to do, but I do want to end on a positive note and say again that I'm very positive about the transatlantic relationship once my new government is in place and the new year starts. And also on the American side, many policy processes have been finished and we can really get to the substance of things with the many challenges that we have. And I think this German-American conference is a great venue. And a year from now, when we have it again, hopefully more in person even than this time, that we can look back on this year and see that the rifts that you mentioned in the beginning or some open questions and differences have been settled. And I'm very positive about that, but I will say that it takes more than governments, and it takes students, and it takes educational institutions and many more to do it and to to face these challenges. So it's on all of you, and thank you for that.
So, and can I just say one very,
of course, come back in.
Yes. Very last. I mean, this is such a nice, inspiring note to end on. But one thing I just want to add is that we've just had an hour discussion about democracy, not mentioned COVID once, which suggests to me either we are totally off topic or maybe the world is changing. So that's a good news message.
I think we just wanted an hour off, not off talking about COVID. Very fair point. And we didn't talk about impacts of COVID on democracy, which was probably not that great in the short term. But listen, I mean, we did cover a lot else. So forgive me if I elided that. It was great. It was a really interesting panel. So many sort of thought-provoking ideas there. Let's keep following it up on social media. But from my point of view, thank you very much indeed for coming and being so open to challenge. And thank you to the GAC and the wonderful team there, to Sophie, to Isabel, and everybody else who has been involved. I know there's a lot of heavy lifting before we get our star panel together. So thank you so much, and hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye now.